In the name of one God, creator, redeemer, and sustainer of our lives. Amen. Today's lectionary readings are kind of a setup to talk about temptation. Lent began on Wednesday, and historically the practice of the church has been to do some sort of fast during Lent. A fast, some sort of giving up of something as a way of focusing ourselves spiritually. It's actually a good practice, or can be a good practice. As the lives of generations, I think that's why it has persisted and remains one of the main spiritual practices of many religious faiths. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, fasting. That's during Ramadan, they do a fast. During Lent, Christians do a fast. And it's not so much that God is against you eating chocolate or God is against you eating meat. These texts are kind of a setup. Often often people give up something for Lent and then somehow you've got to resist the temptation to eat it. And that's part of the goal, is that somehow you're going to give up something that you really want and that you really desire, and then you have to sit there and resist the temptation and struggle. And that somehow that's what this is about. And I think that's a thin view of what a fast is and what a fast can mean. Because it's not about whether or not you eat chocolate. It's not about whether or not you do social media during Lent. It's not about whether or not you give up meat or whatever people give. We all have this tendency towards self-reliance. We all have this tendency to use things to self-medicate. We all have this tendency to kind of to rely on things we can control for our own spiritual well-being. So the act of fasting is actually a risk. It's an act of trying to shake up that dynamic and let go of something that we rely on instead of God. To comfort ourselves, to soothe ourselves, to make us feel okay, to make us feel safe. And so the fast is actually a spiritual practice of giving up something and instead trusting in God and letting God be God in our lives. It's this continual process that we all have and that we all need, of stepping into letting God be God and reminding ourselves that we are not God, and taking on that level of humility. So that's actually at its best what a fast should be. It's a practice that we have. It's something we can risk and experiment with. Unfortunately gets laden with this sense of duty and obligation and guilt. And it shouldn't be laden with duty and obligation and guilt. It's actually something that is kind of an invitation for our own growth. It's an invitation, I love the phrase in the psalm, to step into this God who encircles us with songs of freedom. So I think that in many ways is kind of what the stories, the story that we read, the gospel story we read, is called The Temptation of Jesus. And that might be something of a misnomer, because it follows, Jesus has just, in Matthew, in the story, Jesus has just been baptized by John, and he comes up out of the water, and there's this voice from heaven, the Father's voice. It's this Father's voice that says, "This is my Son, my beloved, this is my love, I am pleased." And so there's this moment where there's God's delight, the Father's delight is just poured out from heaven upon Jesus. And then the Spirit leads Jesus into the wilderness. The Spirit of God leads Jesus into the wilderness to be tested by the devil. Which is odd. What is God doing? Why would God do that? Why would God set Jesus up if it's about temptation, right? And I think it is more about testing. I think the gospel text is really more about testing. That Jesus is led, and the tests are towards his own self-reliance. The tests are towards his own use of his own power. He's been fasting for 40 days like Elijah fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And the children of Israel were in Sinai for 40 years. And Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. So there's this thing about 40 days and 40 nights. Here Jesus is, 40 days and 40 nights, and he's famished. He's hungry. I mean, he's empty in a sense, like he needs something. Like he's in that situation where his own vulnerability, his own humanity is heightened. His dependence upon calories, caloric intake, is just prominent. And the first temptation is to turn stones into bread. And Jesus, and it's he later, what's interesting is Jesus later will take 5 loaves and feed 5,000. Jesus actually will take bread and multiply it in the book of Matthew. Jesus actually will, at the Passover meal, say, "This is my body," right, as he's sitting there holding the bread. Jesus does a lot with bread later in the story. But at this moment, the temptation is to feed yourself. You are hungry, feed yourself. And Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy, where Moses talks about the children of Israel being in the wilderness and eating manna. He says, we do not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. It's about relying on God, the God who is the giver of all good things. Now, that second temptation is about taking Jesus up to the top of the temple, and there's the devil quotes from Psalm, and if I remember correctly, it's Psalm 91, where the psalm is all about how God will shelter you under God's wings. It's this image of a mother hen, where God is seen as a mother hen sheltering God's children with that fiercely motherly, protective pride, for God's children, and how God will protect. And so basically the Satan is saying is, look, if God's going to protect you, try it. Will God really protect you? Throw yourself down from this temple. And Jesus is like, no, that's about my will. That's about me trying to test God. It's not me relying on God for my own security and safety. The irony is, of course, that the story doesn't end well for Jesus. He does end up dying a brutal death. And that third temptation is the temptation towards power, right? Towards earthly power, Satan is bringing Jesus into that moment and on top and looking at all the kingdoms of the world in all their glory and saying, "I will give this to you." And Jesus, who actually will inherit the kingdom of God, says, "No, I don't need this. I don't want this. I will trust in God alone." And so that is, in all 3 of those temptations, that's the call. That's the challenge for all of them, is to rely on Jesus, or to rely on God, this tendency to move beyond our own desire to do that. I was thinking then in the Genesis text, Jesus, and in Jesus' doing all of those, he actually shows what it means to be a son of God. To be the son of God is not to rely on his own power, but to rely on God's goodness, to rely on God's providence, to rely on the goodness of God. The Genesis text, you have God creating humankind and God creating them male and female, and God breathing and God creating them in God's image. So humans are created in the image of God, and God breathes God's breath into them, so they get to receive the breath of God. And so then the temptation for Eve and Adam, because Adam is there with her, both of them there together. The tradition has often said that somehow Eve is responsible because Adam wasn't, she's the one that listened to the snake. And actually Adam was standing right by her the whole time and heard the whole thing, and he was not ignorant of any of it. So it was both of them together doing that. But what the snake says to Eve, it's like, did God say you could eat of every fruit of... Did God say, right? The temptation isn't so much towards the fruit. The temptation is towards wondering and distrusting what God had said. Did God say you could eat of any tree of the garden? And he's like, yeah, we could eat of every tree except for this one, because if we eat of it, we will die. And that's what God told Adam. If you eat of this tree, on that day you will die. And the snake says, you won't die. Instead, if you eat of it, you will become like God. And the snake isn't lying. They do end up dying, but they don't die on that day. And they do become like God. And that's part of the tension in the text. Here they are created in the image of God. And the temptation is for them to eat of this tree and to know good and evil. It's this knowledge of good and evil. And that's what makes, it's God who actually bears the weight of good and bears the weight of evil. But there's something about them eating of the tree of that knowledge of good and evil. And it's not just about knowing that it's good to be nice and kind and giving and forgiving versus mean and selfish and proud. It's not just knowing those things. It's actually knowing in a biblical sense. Meaning you have intimate experience with good and you have intimate experience with evil. And that's part of what this story is about, is that humans have to bear the weight of having the capacity for good and having a profound capacity for evil. We can do both. And that in our being created in the image of God, we have now gained this freedom to do both. And that's the story. I think that's what's true about this story. I don't think this story is history. But it does point to something true about being human. And that we have to bear the weight of being able to be good, and we have to bear the weight of being able to be evil. And once they eat of the fruit of the tree, they know they are naked and they are ashamed. We have to bear the weight of our own nakedness, of our own vulnerability. Trying to find a way to tie those things together. And I guess it is ultimately, in this season of Lent, the call for us, right, is to step into being the invitation to be the children of God that we are. the invitation to be the children of God, to be in relationship with the divine, to be able to have that kind of connection with the divine, where we don't have to just rely on ourselves and our own power and our own, we're not left to ourselves in the weight of, knowing good and evil. So that we are on this journey throughout the season, and there's an invitation to actually step into greater reliance, to actually fast, to be actually able to give up something, or step deeper into our reliance on God. Wish I had a better bow to put on that sermon, but that's what I've got today, so I'll end it there.